Hi, and welcome back to the first chapter of our microbiology course. You'll probably remember that at the end of the last video, we had talked about some very basic characteristics of bacteria, archaea, and protozoa. We also looked at some example organisms for each group. This video is a continuation of our exploration of microorganisms. I'll give a brief description of algae, fungi, parasitic helminths, and viruses. It should be no surprise that your objectives for this video are to describe the basic characteristics of algae, fungi, parasitic helminths, and viruses, and you should be able to give an example of each. Be certain that you can write down how or why your example microorganism is important in our lives. Algae is a general term for a large group of aquatic eukaryotes. This group encompasses large, structurally complex marine algae that we know as seaweed, like this kelp here, as well as microscopic freshwater forms like Spirogyra and the diatoms that you see here. Algae can be unicellular, like the diatoms, or multicellular, like the seaweeds, but they can also be colonial, like these guys. This is Volvox. The organisms in this circular colony are all unicellular, but they choose to live in a group together. A few characteristics of your algae are, number one, they live in aquatic environments, and they can be motile. So some algae, for example, will have flagella that they can use to swim, or they can be non-motile, like the seaweeds again. The unique characteristic for your algae is that they're very similar to plants. They're photosynthetic, they have cells with cellulose in their cell walls. But algae are not plants. They don't make leaves, they don't have roots, they don't have plant tissues like phloem and xylem. They don't make seeds, they don't make flowers, and they don't make nuts. So they're not plants, although they look like them. Some of the benefits that algae provide to us is that they're food for higher organisms like us. They're also major producers of oxygen in our atmosphere. Occasionally, microscopic algae can grow uncontrolled because they're in unusually warm water, like what happens here in Massachusetts in the summer. Or they're growing in water with elevated nitrogen, phosphorus, or iron levels from, say, agricultural pollutants like animal waste or chemical fertilizers. This overgrowth often results in a harmful algal bloom, or HAB. In marine or brackish water, HABs are usually caused by the overgrowth of microscopic algae and dinoflagellates. Freshwater blooms are usually caused by cyanobacteria and large and small algae. Water that has a harmful algal bloom occurring will look murky, kind of like what you see here, and it may take on a greenish or a brownish tint. You may also see green, brown, red, or blue masses of algae suspended just below the water's surface. Bubbles and foul smells may also accompany these changes. Many of the algae that cause these blooms produce toxins that can cause illness and death in aquatic animals, humans, and land animals that venture too close to contaminated water. When the toxins are aerosolized, for example, when contaminated water slaps up against rocks or the shore, they can cause eye irritations and asthma-like symptoms if they're inhaled. When the toxins land on exposed skin, they can cause irritations. When the toxins are ingested, say by eating shellfish that was growing in contaminated water, or with animals when they lick their fur after a dip in contaminated water. Gastrointestinal symptoms like stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea can result. With a large enough dose of toxin, liver damage or neurological damage can happen, and in extreme exposures, like from eating contaminated seafood, death can be the result. By the way, the algae aren't only a problem when they're alive. When they finally die and decompose, decomposition usually reduces the concentration of oxygen dissolved in water, and this leads to fish kills because the fish suffocate. Fungi are eukaryotic, unicellular, or multicellular organisms, kind of like this mushroom that you see here. These organisms can live independently or they can live in a symbiosis. So this is a SCOBY. It's the thing that makes kombucha. And it's basically yeasts, which are fungi, mixed with bacteria growing together. This is lichen, which you'll probably recognize from the side of a tree. It's a symbiosis between algae and fungi. So fungi can live independently, like your yeasts in this mushroom, or they can live together with other organisms. The unique characteristic that all fungi have is they have chitin in their cell wall. So remember, the cell wall is like a rigid border just outside of the plasma membrane of the cells for these organisms, and it's made out of chitin. Chitin is the same carbohydrate complex that makes up the shells on certain crustaceans and the exoskeletons on insects. Your fungi can reproduce sexually or asexually, and they are all heterotrophs. Heterotrophs, remember, absorb nutrients from their environment and then turn that into energy. So all of your fungi, no matter what color they are heterotrophs. In our world, your fungi are your major decomposers, like the bacteria. They provide food, if you think about mushrooms, for example, and yeasts and things like that. And they're important in species control. So most fungi are harmless, but there are a small number that are pathogens. And when they infect a host, the results can be deadly. Here are some examples of fungi. The most common type of fungus is actually a mold, kind of like this penicillium mold growing on bread. As you can see, a mold's body is, or thallium, is kind of circular in shape, and it's called a mycelium. A closer look at this mycelium will reveal hair-like structures that kind of protrude from the base of the fungus. These hair-like structures are called hyphae, and the mold uses them to absorb nutrients from the environment as well as for reproduction. Under a microscope, some of the hyphae will look like this. This is the reproductive part. You might recognize these little balls here as being spores. Each spore is capable of producing an entire new fungus, a new mold. Another example of a fungus would be Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which you see here. This is also called brewer's yeast. It's the yeast that we add to bread dough to make the bread dough puff up or rise, to make it light and airy. These yeasts metabolize sugar in the dough, and then they excrete carbon dioxide, which is where the holes come from in your bread. They also make a bit of alcohol, but when you bake the bread, that cooks off. Saccharomyces cerevisiae has been used by scientists as a model for a eukaryotic cell. So work with these these yeasts have helped us to understand how eukaryotes turn on some genes and turn others off. We've also figured out how to insert foreign genes into the DNA of these cells so that we can stimulate them to produce things like vaccines, proteins that you might find, or enzymes that you might find in your detergent, and therapeutic drugs. Parasitic worms are eukaryotic organisms, And as you can tell by Ascaris here or Dronunculus here, they're macroscopic. We can see them with our naked eye. The reason they're studied in microbiology is because they spend part of their life cycle either as eggs or as larvae in a microscopic form. There are 4 characteristics that we find with the parasitic helminths. They all have a mouth, but only some of them have a digestive system. This is because many of them latch on to human tissues and they derive their nutrients directly from our tissues. For worms in particular that are in the intestines, the food that comes to them has been pre-digested by their human hosts, so they don't need a digestive system. These worms will have reduced nervous systems because they don't need a nervous system to coordinate a lot of sensory information and motor information. They're not running after a host to infect it. Usually they wait for a host to either eat them or drink them, or they may burrow through the skin. These worms usually have reduced or they lack locomotion. And another characteristic is that they all have complex reproductive cycles. They're all going to pass through more than one organism during their lifetime. Typically, your parasitic helminths are responsible for causing the malabsorption of nutrients. Some cause anemia. Worms like Ascaris here, which is rather large, can actually fill the intestines and cause obstructions. They may cause inflammations as they burrow through different tissues in their host. They can cause pain, neurological problems, and because they're absorbing so many nutrients from their host, in children, a worm infection could lead to growth retardation. Typically, people acquire infections with these parasitic helminths through contaminated food or contaminated soil or water. Sometimes they even burrow through the skin. Now, parasitic helminths are not a problem so much in the United States because of our sanitation practices, but in developing countries, up to a third to half of humans can actually be infected by these worms. So those were all of the living microorganisms. Let's take a look at viruses. Viruses are acellular, non-living nuggets of protein. So you have a protein shell like this, which is called a capsid. The purple here is a protein shell. Okay. And then inside of that protein shell, that capsid, you have nucleic acids like DNA or RNA, but never both. Viruses are super tiny. We can only see them really with an electron microscope. There's a few exceptions to that, but most of them are measured on the nanometer scale. So 1 nanometer is basically 1/1 billionth of a meter. Your average virus is somewhere between, I don't know, 50 to 100 nanometers in size. So they're super tiny. Viruses are only considered to be living when they're reproducing inside of a cell. And most scientists are actually not even going to consider it to be living then. It's just that's when the virus takes on the most characteristics that look like a living organism. An example of a virus would be the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is going around the nation right now, and it causes COVID-19. So you'll remember, hopefully, that this is an RNA-based virus, and it's transmitted through respiratory emissions. So when someone's sneezing, when someone's talking, when someone is laughing or coughing, they eject small particles of saliva and mucus, and this virus can be found inside of those droplets, and they can stay suspended in the air for about 8 minutes. The virus is extremely contagious, and for most people, it doesn't cause any severe symptoms, but for a small percentage of people, it causes some very severe and long short-term complications such as respiratory problems, heart attack, stroke. We're even seeing a very unusual syndrome in some children, which scientists are saying is like Kawasaki syndrome, where there's extreme inflammation of the blood vessels. Now let's see what you remember. Which of the following is a photosynthetic eukaryote with cellulose in its cell wall? Would that be fungi, bacteria, or algae? Did you say algae? If you did, that'd be correct. Remember, algae are similar to plants, but they're not plants. One similarity is the cellulose in an algae cell wall. Another similarity is that algae are photosynthetic, like plants are. How about this one? Viruses are, number 1, infectious particles made of protein and nucleic acids. Number 2, non-living. Or number 3, specialized cells. There's more than one answer here. Right, they're infectious particles made of protein and nucleic acids, and viruses are also non-living. Here's one more. Which of the following is not a characteristic of helminths? And we're talking about the parasitic helminths here. Is it reduced locomotion, complex reproduction, or growth as a mycelium? Right. Helminths do not grow as a mycelium. That's a characteristic of certain fungi. We've reached the end of this video. I've described the basic characteristics of algae, fungi, parasitic helminths, and viruses. I've also given you at least one example for each group. For your exam, you'll want to know one example of an algae, a fungus, a parasitic helminth, and a virus. In addition, you'll want to know what that organism causes or what it does. So on your exam, you could have a question that says, an example of a fungus is blank. It causes or produces blank. So you could say, an example of a fungus is penicillium. It makes or it causes penicillin production or blue cheese production, or it an example of a fungus would be Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It makes bread. In the next video, I'm going to talk about some areas of our life where microorganisms play a prominent role. I'll see you in that video next time.